Here at Cavalcade of News in Nashville, Tennessee, we've been deluged with questions and inquiries as to the controversy surrounding possibly the hoax of the death of Elvis Presley. And we figured to get to the source, we'll have to go directly to the source, and that is to the man who was responsible for setting up the funeral and handling the funeral arrangements for Elvis Presley, his longtime friend and bass singer, Mr. J.D. Sumner. And he's agreed to meet with some of us here from the Cavalcade of News publication to ask some questions. Mr. Sumner, how did you first come to meet Elvis, and under what circumstances?
Elvis lived 2 blocks from the Ellis Auditorium in Memphis, Tennessee. Was a young boy of 14 years old, and he used to come to the gospel sings that the Blackwood brothers had at the Ellis Auditorium in Memphis. And at that time, he was 14 years old and was not in the business, just coming to hear us sing. He would stand around backstage and hang around with me, ask questions, and that's the way I first met Elvis Presley. Of course, at that time, I didn't even know his name.
So he was just a fan hanging around backstage for all you knew?
Just a little boy hanging around backstage, was more or less, to an extent, a nuisance, asking questions, which wasn't important to me, but I guess they was to him. But that's my first recollection of knowing the Elvis Presley.
And that was at a gospel music concert, a gospel quartet concert, right?
Gospel quartet concert, because that was Elvis's bag. Elvis grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, and at that time, the Melody Boys were on in Little Rock. He could pick up that station, Joe Roper and the Melody Boys. And the Blackwood brothers were on in Memphis, Tennessee, and every quartet that he could tune in, well, he listened to, because that was his favorite kind of music.
Donna Sodders, was gospel music really his favorite kind of music?
Well, it's all he listened to. I couldn't say that it was his favorite, but well, I would have to, I guess, because it's what he loved to listen to. Elvis never listened to nothing but gospel music. Even in his music room or television room now at Graceland, you can go by and look at the records, the albums that are on display there, and you'll see nothing but gospel quartets, including the Blackwood brothers, the Stamps, the Statesmen, Florida Boys, the Imperial, the Spear family. He had them all.
Well, Mr. Sumner, how did your group, the Stamps and yourself, begin working with Elvis?
Well, years ago, I had Sumar Talent Agency. In that agency, I had the Imperials, and it was sort of a management booking agency. And the Imperials were working with Elvis, and they also started booking with Jimmy Dean, and they had a double booking. They come up and had some dates booked with Jimmy Dean, and Elvis decided he wanted to make a tour. When Elvis decided he wanted to go, well, he wanted to go. And came up that the Imperials were under contract to Jimmy Dean and could not make this tour. So Elvis called me and wanted me to get him a quartet that was good enough to go with him on this tour to replace the Imperials. At that time, I had Richard Sturbin, who is now with the Oak Ridge Boys, singing bass. I had Bill Bays. I had the quartet that I thought that was good enough to back up Elvis Presley. So I told him, I said, it just so happens that the Stamps can go with you on this tour. I'll send you a record of them. We had just a brand new record just released. I sent him a record, and my idea was to put the Stamps on there, and me, at that time, I was trying to retire. Is the reason I hired Richard Sturbin. So I thought if I could get the Stamps Quartet a gig that I wouldn't have to sing on, then I could go and play golf, stay with my wife. But it didn't work out that way. When we got to Milwaukee, our first date, to start the tour, to start rehearsing, I went along just to see that the Stamps Quartet done their job and done it right to get everything under control. But Elvis told me, and in fact in the rehearsal room, I was sitting out in a chair and everybody else was up on the little stage that they had built to rehearse, and Elvis said, "Get up here, J.D., I want you to sing bass." I said, "You don't need me, I got a bass singer." He said, "No, I want you. I want some of those 56 endings." Like what he meant by that was the way I always slur down on the end of a song. Ooh, yeah. That's what he wanted. And so I found myself backing up Elvis Presley when it wasn't my intentions.
Mr. Sumner, my name's David Taylor, and I'm from Ranger, Mississippi. And was there any drugs involved in the organization?
There was a lot of drugs, a lot of different kinds of pills. The Stanley boys, some of my boys. I never used any drugs, but there was a lot of drugs. Elvis Presley was on prescribed drugs. Elvis had glaucoma. He had a colon problem. He had different problems that he was on prescribed drugs. But there was a lot of drugs that were gotten in Elvis's name that Elvis knew nothing about. And when they would get to Las Vegas, even some of the Stamps Quartet would get into that black bag and get a handful of different kinds of pills. I never took but one pill supposed to pick you up or keep you awake, and it was a black widow, a black spider, or something or other. And I took one of them and chewed my tongue for 4 days, and that's the last one I ever took. But there was a lot of drugs, but there wasn't for Elvis Presley. They were bought in his name. There was prescriptions that was forged. Dr. Nick's name was forged to get prescriptions filled at the drugstore, but they were not for Elvis Presley.
Mr. Sumner, could you please describe for us the events of August the 16th, 1977, in the life and through the eyes of J.D. Sumner?
My wife, Mary, had taken me to the airport and had taken our grandson, Jason, and Elvis had sent his Jetstar to pick up the Nashville people, which included Felton Jarvis and the Stamps Quartet and myself. We were on his plane fixing to leave, and they come on the plane and told us that the tour had been canceled, that it was off. And I couldn't believe it. I tried to question it, and I said, "Why has it been canceled?" "Well, believe me, it's canceled. And if they knew, they didn't tell us." So the tour's been canceled, just go back home. So my wife had not left, and waiting to see me off on the plane like everybody does. So I got in the car with my wife and my grandson and started home, wondering myself as much as anybody why the tour had been canceled. I thought possibly that maybe something had happened to Vernon Presley, Elvis's dad, because he was a very sick man. On the way home, we had the radio on, which I very seldom play the radio in the car, but that day we had it on. It was real dark. The clouds were real dark. Looked like it was going to storm. And I guess we had the radio on to see if there was a tornado or something in the area. And they announced that the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, was found dead at 2 o'clock today, and this was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And immediately nobody said anything. I didn't say anything, my wife said nothing, and even my grandson, being 2 years old, didn't even say anything, and he didn't even know what was going on. But I didn't believe that Elvis was dead. I thought, well, this is either a thing that the colonel has pulled for publicity, or either Vernon's dead and there's been some mistake. So I went on home. When I got home, in a dilemma, not knowing what to do. My daughter came running up the hill. We lived out in Bellevue, and she come running up the hill to my house and said, "Daddy, have you heard that Elvis is dead?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm going to Memphis to find out what's wrong," because I didn't believe then that he was dead. So I got my bus driver, and Elvis had given me a limousine, a Lincoln limousine with a television, bar, and the whole works in it. Called my bus driver and got my son-in-law, and we headed to Memphis. When I headed down toward Graceland and seen the crowd that was gathered on each side of the highway and even in the middle of the street, then I realized that in all probability that it was so, that Elvis was dead. I pulled on up against what the police said I could do, because they said nobody could go into Graceland. But I pulled up to the gates, forced my way past the police, pulled up to the gates, and they saw who it was, and they opened the gates, and I pulled in. When I got into Graceland, of course, like when anybody dies, there was people sitting around crying, talking. And when I got there, they said, "Vernon wants to see you." Vernon was in a little suite deal that they had in Graceland for Elvis's aunt, his Aunt Delta. She was more or less in charge of the housekeeping for Elvis. I went in there, and Vernon was in there, and his mother and Delta was in there. And Vernon asked me, I tried to console Vernon like anybody would do, and then he asked me if I would be in charge of the funeral. He said, "You knew more about what he liked, what songs he liked, and who he would like to have preach the funeral, his favorite preacher, this, that, and the other." He said, "Would you handle it for me?" I said, "Yes, sir." So as soon as I could, I got out and checked into a motel, and immediately started calling. The first thing I done was to call, of course, my wife, and tell her that it was so, that he was dead. And then I called Resampler. Then I called the different ones that I knew that Elvis would love to have sing, which was, of course, the Stamps Quartet. I called the Statesman Quartet, and got James Blackwood of the Blackwood Brothers. And that's the people that sang at Elvis's funeral, was the Stamps Quartet. Jake Hess, which was Elvis's favorite gospel singer. I suppose if you would pick out one man that Elvis tried to copy or sing like, it would have been Jake Hess. I picked out the people that I knew that Elvis would want to sing in the songs. I had Kathy Westmoreland sing "My Heavenly Father Watches Over Me," and picked out, well, we sung "Sweet Spirit," "Known Only to Him," "How Great Thou Art," the songs that Elvis had us to sing almost every time we got together. Well, those are the songs that we sang at his funeral.
Mr. Sumner, now, in lieu of all of the controversy, I just got to come out and ask you like this. Is Elvis dead?
I buried my mother last year, and if somebody were to come up and tell me they saw my mother and she was living, then I would hit them. I buried my best friend. That was Elvis. I was in charge of his funeral. I wish that he wasn't dead, but Elvis Presley died, and he's buried in 6 tons of cement. He was first buried in the cemetery in a mausoleum, and they had threats of somebody going to steal his body, so Vernon got permission from the city to move his body out to Graceland, and along with that, they were able to dig up Elvis's mother and bury her at Graceland. So Elvis Presley is buried at Graceland, and his mother is. Of course, since then, well, his grandmother has died, and Vernon has died. So Elvis Presley is dead and buried at Graceland.
Mr. Sumner, could you tell us why Elvis's casket was so heavy? Was it because of a cooling unit that could possibly have been put in there for preserving a waxed figure? Just why was the casket so heavy?
Well, in the first place, who said the casket was heavy? Where did all this brilliant information come from? The casket was heavy. I sang at his mother's funeral. When my mother died, she was buried in a mausoleum in a crypt. So I didn't buy a real expensive casket to put her in. Her casket cost $900. When Elvis's mother passed away, Elvis was a young man, and he got the very best casket that he could find. He would have spent $1 million if they would have had one that cost $1 million. He would have spent that for it. They found in Oklahoma City a casket that was solid copper. The more you pay for it, naturally, the better the casket is. Elvis's casket was heavy because it was solid copper. The same casket that his mother was buried in, the same type of casket. When Elvis died, then Vernon wanted Elvis buried in the same kind of casket that his mother was buried in. So he got Joe Esposito to call Oklahoma City and get the same casket equivalent that his mother was buried in. So it was a heavy casket. But as far as it being a wax dummy in the casket and an air conditioning, that is the most stupid. Elvis Presley was in the casket. I helped color in his hair where it needed touched up because Elvis kept his hair dyed. Elvis would have been gray-headed had he not have done that, like me. But Elvis, his hair needed to be touched up, and his hair was touched up. That was Elvis Presley in the casket. There was no air conditioning in the casket. There was no piece of wax. There was no reason for no air conditioning in the casket. That's just a bona fide implication that it implies a lie. I wouldn't say that something is a lie, but the implications was that if that has been implied that there's an air conditioning and a piece of wax in that casket, then it implies a lie.
Mr. Sumner, what about the story about his hairdresser gluing his sideburns on?
His hairdresser, as such, he had no hairdresser. He had a guy that if he was there, sometimes he would let him do his hair. Charlie Hodge was Elvis's hairdresser. He'd done more of fixing Elvis's hair than anybody else. There was not anybody that was a hairdresser for Elvis Presley. Charlie Hodge, if there'd been anybody with that title, it should have been given to Charlie Hodge, because he done his hair every night before he went on stage. And at any time he went any place where Charlie Hodge done his hair. But there was no hairdresser. There was a guy there, Gallagher, that was supposed to, that sort of got out and said that he was Elvis's hairdresser, but he wasn't.
Why is there no death certificate?
Well, I am sure there's a death certificate because he's dead. A death certificate is not something that you put up on the wall of an accomplishment. When this question came up to me about Elvis's death certificate, I asked my wife, I said, honey, where is Mama's death certificate? I had never seen it. My wife said it's in the Bible. I have never seen my mother's death certificate. I don't want to see her death certificate. I doubt very seriously that Vernon ever looked at it, because he did not need to look at a death certificate to know that he had lost a son. And I don't need to see a death certificate to know that Elvis is dead. Seeing him dead is enough for me.
Mr. Sumner, why was there no life insurance policy collected on Elvis's death?
Well, people like Elvis Presley, John Wayne, John Kennedy, John Lennon, people like that don't have insurance. People like myself, I have insurance policy. But what kind of a policy would have been on Elvis Presley? People like Elvis Presley own the insurance company. They don't buy insurance, they own the company. When I was a young boy, my mother and daddy took out a $300 policy on all of us kids. And that policy cost a nickel a week. That policy was kept for years on me until me and my wife just cashed it in and got what little we could get out of it. Elvis was much poorer than our family was, the Presleys were. So what kind of policy would they have had? Would it have been for $150 or $200? And would Elvis have paid the nickel a week or the 3 cents a week that it took? I doubt very seriously. Elvis Presley spent $500,000 like I would spend $100. So I don't see any need that Elvis Presley would have for a $10,000 policy, a $20,000 policy, a $100,000 policy, or $1 million policy. Lisa Marie, in 5 years, will inherit what Elvis left, and she won't even need no insurance policy because it's supposed to be in the vicinity of $200 million, and I doubt that she'll need a policy whatsoever.